So just as a bit of an agenda of the topics we're going to be going through. So myself and Andrew will be covering what is needed for adoption, how to establish users in a tool selection criteria, and finally the benefits of going through an EA tool as well. And what we'll try and do for this is leave about 10, 15 minutes potentially for questions at the end. So please do write these down throughout in that Q&A function. So just a little bit of background on Avolution as we get started, especially for those of you who are new for joining us in this. So Avolution has now been running for 20 years after being founded at the University of Technology over in Sydney in 2001. We now have 7 offices worldwide, giving us a reach of 100 different countries and therefore 3,000 different companies. Now, one thing we're very proud of and point to note really for ourselves in these presentations is that we've been as the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and the Forrester Wave as of their latest EA tool reviews. Now, talking about EA tools, just a little bit of terminology to explain potentially from what you may hear today, and hopefully will give you a bit of an understanding of when you hear this. Abacus really is made up of 2 fully integrated platforms. So it's Abacus Studio and Abacus Enterprise. Now these are connected via a collaboration server and run off the same centralized repository. So the idea being that you create a single version of truth throughout the product. So Abacus Studio, when you hear that today, this is where your EAs will be doing a lot of the work. You're pulling the data into initially, configuring a meta model, setting up viewpoints, setting your users and permissions within this as well. And then you branch out, if you will, into the pretty leaves of the product, which is Abacus Enterprise. So this is where you have your rich dynamic visualizations, your interactive dashboards. You increase a lot of collaboration in the team here as well by embedding it in things like Teams, Slack, Confluence, or many of the visualization pieces you may already be using. So with that, we're going to get into the bulk of the presentation here. I'll hand over to Andrew for what is needed for adoption.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. And yeah, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Luthwaite. I'm the pre-sales lead here at Avolution. And so as Scott mentioned, we'll be going through a bit of a back and forth here of who's presenting what. But initially, I want to talk about what is needed for adoption across a couple of different areas, really. The first thing really to focus on is the role of an EA, the role of an enterprise architect within any organization. And you've likely heard from, of course, other EAs today and yesterday, and also from Tim O'Neill with the first presentation yesterday morning around who the EA should be reporting into. And maybe historically, enterprise architects have maybe stemmed from this technology landscape or the IT department. And initiating change from that area, of course, is quite difficult, especially when you're trying to convince the business to reduce costs, etc. And as Tim mentioned, they might just see the IT or the technology department as just another cost center. So as an EA, we really do think that they should be reporting up the higher levels. So up to that C level, where they might be directly influencing or at least discussing the various operational and strategic decisions that are being made across the organization. So EAs really do need to have an oversight across all of these other areas, people, processes, and technologies. And really, enterprise architects, I guess over time, tend to fall into more of a consulting capacity, where they really do need broad expertise across each of these domains to actually make those types of decisions. So really, the role here is EA should be acting as a bit of a bridge across each of these domains, just to make sure everything is aligned and is working efficiently. And that also comes on to EAs within different styles or different sizes of teams. And we work with customers, as Scott has mentioned, across the world, those who might fall into new EA teams or maybe are new to EA tools, and also those who come from larger EA teams or teams who have used many tools before. And there are some, let's say, challenges that go alongside each of these types of teams. So certainly one of the key things for new EA teams is to actually prove the value of EA and likely the value of an EA tool. But that can come from usually the lack of experience that they might have initially. And so one of the solutions that we found that works quite well here is to build some consistency and some confidence in the results that you're actually delivering to your stakeholders. Okay, so the lack of experience there is almost a double-edged sword. It means you can likely adapt a bit quicker and actually try new things. Maybe there aren't any expectations on the team, and it means hopefully that you can actually derive some of the results then as well. Sometimes there's role confusion within new EA teams as well. So certainly one of the things that we've seen that's beneficial is to at least try to get some level of ownership or accountability. So maybe a typical racing matrix of who should be involved within the decisions that are being made. Now, existing EA teams also have their challenges as well. So certainly at the beginning for EA teams, you might have a small team who can work effectively well together. But as that team grows, you do need to make sure that you can communicate effectively. And so over the years, we've seen maybe a lack or maybe just poor collaboration across certain teams. The tool can obviously help in that capacity, but really the fundamentals there are having a good level of communication across the organization and across all the teams that are involved as well. And the other thing to quickly mention for existing EA teams is to have a clear strategy. With so many different users, domains, and stakeholders involved, there at times can be a slight misalignment between what the objectives are. So a clear strategy is important for, of course, both new EA teams, more so for these existing EA teams who might have multiple use cases in mind. Now, typically, when we start thinking of EA adoption, of course, from our perspective, it's usually the adoption of EA, but also the adoption of an EA tool. We've split this into 3 phases. So the first phase is this acceleration phase. When we're first starting off, we want to make sure that we can actually get some quick wins out of a tool to show that it's being a worthwhile investment. I'm not going to dive too much into these quick wins. And we've also got a great presentation later on today from Corinna and Kabe from the US team, who will talk about this in much more detail. The other key thing from this acceleration phase is we want to make sure that we're actually building relevant content for the relevant stakeholder. We aren't simply just building views for the sake of ticking boxes from an EA perspective. We want to make sure that they're actually actionable results that we're getting. And of course, finally, just focus on a few key areas. Don't try to adopt too many use cases at the beginning. Try to prove the value early on. Now, as we go through that acceleration phase, we now want to get into this phase of building, whether that's building a bigger team, whether that's growing the data sets and the use cases. Again, there are various areas that we should be considering for this. Ownership and governance is something we've quickly mentioned for, of course, new EA teams, but scaling, of course, is important as well. And scaling the user base doesn't necessarily mean more users in the tool. It means more users using the content from the tool. So really, we want to make sure that there are other areas involved as we start growing the EA team. At the beginning, we might have also tried to maybe hack our way through and just import a few data sources. At this stage, we really want to be looking at automating a lot of that work. And we would have heard a great presentation from Brian there about automating data imports, building algorithms and analysis. This is the stage where we really want to start building a few smarter ways of working within the tool. And then finally, we get to this communicate stage. This really is a development phase. This is where we want to make sure that we've proven the value of EA. We've built a good single source of truth, a good repository. And now we have additional use cases from other teams. We as the EAs within the organization are seen as trusted advisors. We're giving good advice, good confidence in the results that we're proving within the tool. And of course, most importantly, we're actually making proactive decisions. We're not reacting to certain things. We can actually start suggesting different landscapes to move into. So certainly from an adoption phase, we want to make sure that all of these are taken into consideration, but also keep in mind for different teams, we'll also have different types of users. So Scott, back over to you.
Very smooth transition. Thank you, Andrew. So in order to explain how to establish users in a tool, We've split this into 3 different sections to think about. So firstly, roles. So you want to be able to understand and define key users that you want utilizing a tool. So what we may call editors, modelers, viewers, studio users, especially if you've used Abacus before, you've heard these terms come up. It's important for you to establish yourself what user groups you want accessing the tool, whether they be your own modelers, the application owners, data contributors, and not to forget those consuming the data as well. The second element to focus on is that outcomes part. So in order to interpret the needs of the team and what outcomes they're looking for, want certain stakeholders to see, they might want to see potential solutions or diagrams from the data, and not necessarily want to see the Archimate or TOGAF detailed diagrams that have been drawn, but it's really those outcomes they are looking for towards the end. And finally, access. Now we split access into 2 here. Firstly, it's ensuring users can access and consume the data from their existing tools. So as I mentioned at the start, if they can get a window through Teams, SharePoint, Confluence to the visualizations or outcomes they want to see through a tool, and if they can use a tool they're already familiar with to see this, you'll increase the adoption throughout the team picking this up. And secondly, we're talking about something slightly different. So not all users will need access to everything. So think about the permissions here as well. So keeping stakeholders' home pages refined will reduce distractions and make it easier to find decision analysis related to their use case as well. So some considerations between those roles, outcomes, and access when deciding this.
Perfect, thank you, Scott. And now over maybe to some of the criteria around tool selection. And of course, it wouldn't be a WebEx from us as a vendor without talking about tools. But there are a few important aspects around tool selection that we should probably dive into. And the first is around the actual selection process. So there's a few things that we found over time that most customers would go through. And some of those stages, certainly at the beginning, is making sure that there's enough focus on the use cases, the problems that you actually want to solve. Now, of course, a tool isn't a silver bullet. It won't solve all of your problems. But ideally, there needs to be a use case for a tool selection process. If there are no problems within the organization, there are no use cases for a tool, and therefore there's no need for a tool, very likely. But certainly the focus has to be on those at the beginning. And then more into some of the practical aspects. So you want to make sure that you can trial some of the features and the benefits of a tool. Some customers might run through more of a documented evaluation, so things like an RFP process. Maybe there's more governance around that, and you want to use sources like G-Cloud, for example, over here. And then finally, there might be a stage where we start looking at proof of concepts. Now, it's not necessarily the case that all of these get taken into consideration. Some customers might be happy with a trial of the tool and think it's a good fit. Others want to prove more specific use cases against other tools and other criteria, and therefore want to go through a proof of concept. But there are pros and cons to each of these. Proof of concepts specifically, they are a good way of evaluating a tool's capability for your specific purpose. So using your own data, importing that into a tool, building specific use cases and evaluation, getting other users involved with that evaluation. However, it can of course be time consuming. So of course, not all customers will want to go through a very formal proof of concept, but also keep in mind for proof of concepts, it's not just the tool that you're testing. You're testing the organization, the support team, the consulting team, the feel of the organization. When you're looking for a specific tool, you want to make sure that you're actually going to be supported with that tool. And of course, not just something that you'll have to use on your own. So as much as these are more practical tips for a selection process, they are, of course, quite useful for the adoption of EA in general as well. Also, more specifically around tools, we want to make sure that we're buying or at least procuring a tool that isn't necessarily just for the architects. We want to have specific dashboards that are dynamic, that users can drill down through. We want to democratize some of the data collection, allowing any user to actually contribute to the portfolios we're building. But also for those architects, we want to make sure that there's an environment where they can run some complex analysis, where they can do the EA work of providing what-if scenarios. So these are some of the more fundamental aspects of a tool. But all of this really does come down into the idea that most tools or products are just a collection of features. Now, of course, when all those features come together, we'll have a single product that we can package up. But don't get too disillusioned or too caught up on all features of all tools. I think hopefully everyone on the call maybe has some experience of EA tools. And there are some common things that you might look out for, such as, can we draw our diagrams? Can we import data? And that's important, but that's hopefully these days general, although not always, as I've seen, across most, if not all, EA tools. So from our experience, and certainly the feedback that we've had from all of our customers, I just want to pinpoint a few features that I think are beneficial. So the first is around the API or integrations. We want to make sure that we can actually use a tool that has an open API. We want to bring in data from other sources. We want to push data out of our tool to those sources as well. So an API is going to be really useful for connecting to ServiceNow, your SharePoint sites, your local Excel files, but also making sure, like you might have seen some of our customers talk about, using that data elsewhere. Chatbots that are feeding data directly from Abacus, for example, is just one interesting use case that we've seen customers use the API for. The second is to have some concept of multiple architectures. As architects, we of course want an environment where we can build a good baseline of what we look like, but more often than not, as you've already seen, we want to understand what we're going to look like in the future. So Nick's presentation yesterday on the United States of Architectures was a great example of how we can actually use scenarios and model different scenarios to actually understand the benefits of certain projects or programs that we're working on. Additionally, there should be a lot of flexibility and agility within the tool. I have been asked the question before, is Abacus an agile tool? And I think that's probably maybe the incorrect question to be asking. Really, does the tool provide us the ability to work in an agile manner? I think is probably a bit more correct, in the sense that you want to make those changes quickly. If someone asks a question, we need to give them a bit more of a self-service environment that they can access that data within. And as things are constantly changing, we need to have that agility and flexibility to manage each of those situations. So we don't want to be locked down into single models or single frameworks. We want to have that ability to adapt and customize as the times move forward. Another is dashboarding. So when we actually build our models within a tool, we want to make sure that everyone has access to that data. So whether that's users accessing it from Teams or Confluence, making sure that those non-EA users or non-architects can actually take the work that's been done, the different scenarios that have been modeled, and then make decisions off the back of those models. So dashboarding, of course, gives us the ability to communicate that work throughout the organization. And finally, for this one, is the ability to have algorithms for analysis. So algorithms can fall into different categories. We really think of them as maybe, I guess we say deterministic and non-deterministic. That's the ability to have algorithms that we build, where with the same input, we'll get the same output. And we think of those as no-code algorithms, where we're dragging and dropping blocks of functionality. We're building specific formulas for an output or calculating scores. They're really useful for things like cloud migration projects or building tech debt scores, which you've seen hopefully. They are, of course, very beneficial for that. But then we also have the slightly more cutting edge side of things around things like machine learning. So the ability for a tool to analyze the data and suggest and recommend certain outputs. So whether it's recommending that we should be retiring an application or recommending that we move an application to cloud based on all of the other data that we fed into the tool. So both of those aspects become more important. Certainly not all of these are going to be useful on day one, but as usual for these things, we want to make sure that we can actually set up a tool that's useful in the long term and not the short term. Finally, though, I would strongly suggest that we don't just look at the features. The features are there for a single purpose, really, and the purpose of those features is to actually start delivering some benefits out of the tool. Scott, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So yeah, as Andrew said, talking about the way we're going to talk about our final point today, the benefits of an EA tool, particularly, we've decided to look at a real world case study to explain this a little bit better. And what we're using for today is something called the art of resilience. So the person at the front of this, and you may or may not have heard this name before, is the author of the book, The Art of Resilience. It's someone called Ross Edgley. Now, he has some serious credentials to talk about resilience himself. I think he did a full triathlon with a 100-kilo tree attached to him, which is quite impressive. But maybe the one he's known for more than most is swimming 1,780 miles, surviving whirlpools, jellyfish stings, and salt tongue to become the first man to swim around Britain. And some people say potentially most impressive of all is eating 649 bananas in the process. So I think it took him 157 days and about 12 hours of swimming each day. It's absolutely brutal. So why are we bringing up Ross to talk about this? So he gave a great quote in a podcast he did last year about what is resilience and also what it isn't. So to talk about this, one of the quotes he used was that if you're pushing yourself to run a half marathon for the first time and you get a stone in your shoe in the first mile, it is not resilience to keep that stone in your shoe and continue running the race. That's foolish. So how can we relate that back to getting started in architecture particularly? So we're looking at taking the stone out of your shoe in this way as well. And as we've already mentioned, the first point for this is really invest in a tool. So as you can see on screen, hopefully some of these key points of that gain time and value, return on investment from investing in a tool, whether it's $1 million worth of saving in de-risking procurement and installations, 80% of application portfolio reduced. Some of the key metrics Brian was talking about in his network rail presentation as well, or even things like saving days of work by automating some of those updates as well. So the second point, and the second way to take the stone out of your shoe really is utilize experts and training. So personally, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions that goes through everyday life, that practice is perfect. And this is not correct. So Vince Lombardi agrees with me on this, who frequently says this, but practice makes permanent. So get yourself set off on the right foot, utilize experts, get training on key tools or modules you're using to help you, or even partner with experts on these tools to assist you along the way. But make that perfect practice permanent in the long run. And finally, and it's a point we've talked about a lot earlier in this presentation or throughout our digital summit, it's about collaborate with your team. So we want to start spreading the work more. So collaboration can increase the accuracy of your architecture whilst decreasing the duplication of effort and time spent maintaining it. If you start to assign responsibility and make departments accountable, this makes for a more manageable and resilient architecture all round. And hopefully to finish, we've got, whether you see it as a cheesy quote or one that hopefully remember this tips and tricks presentation to wrap things up and think of Ross Edgley. But take the stone out of your practice and get your architecture back in the running. That's really a good way to summarize what we're talking about today as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And that wraps up our presentation.
That was great, guys. Well done. And yes, I think that's a great analogy. Yeah, and I think there's a lesson there for, well, us all, no doubt, as individuals, but as teams working in something like enterprise architecture. I think there's a lot of good lessons to be learned from that. Now, and indeed, I think to some extent, we'll see that as we look through some of the questions, but I'll go through those perhaps in the order that they've come. So these might pick up on some of the earlier topics, guys. So first one relates to the tool or the selection of a tool or tools. Should we look for one tool that does everything or multiple tools? Yeah,
it's a good question. I think Tim actually maybe referred to this in his opening presentation as well, which is, of course, it would be great to have one tool that does everything, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. I think we've come across customers who are already using tools that are heavily embedded in the organization. So that could be, specific CMDBs that they use, or specific data modeling tools, for example. And it isn't always the case, maybe specifically for Abacus, let's say, where we would always recommend migrating everything over. We've got or had experiences with not necessarily our customers, but customers we've spoken to before, where they might have wanted to migrate, 10,000 process diagrams over to Abacus, for example. And so we, as a maybe consulting team, play devil's advocate slightly and ask why that is needed. So yeah, I guess at times, obviously it's nice to have one tool, but it should be more treated as a bit more of a platform where we can actually connect other data sources into Abacus and really just make use of the expertise that have already been built in those other tools. So, coming back to the idea that having an open API makes that available, makes that possible, that has to be a critical part if you do have multiple tools in play. And everyone uses Visio. We're not trying to get people to stop using Visio as much as we'd like to. So there's always going to be a need to maintain integrations to tools like that as well. So certainly a multiple tools approach is fine. Just make sure you've got the right tool for the right job, really.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that, guys. Actually, the next question was sort of developing that in a slightly different way. Is it really necessary to get multiple teams involved, or should it just be the architects that use the tool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Scott can maybe jump in on this afterwards as well, where he talked about the users. But I think at the beginning, a tool isn't necessarily there to just support the architects. The architects, of course, are using that tool. But I think, as you've seen through nearly all of the presentations so far, there's an element of, once we do that work in a tool, how do we actually then display that, communicate that, convince other people of the decisions off of that work? And so I think when we think of maybe multiple teams in this case, we would really just think of that as the entire organization. Everyone should have some kind of input, whether that's correcting data, whether that's saying which applications they use and removing some of that shadow IT within organizations. There should be multiple teams, or in this case, the entire organization involved. But it could just be the architects that are working on specific areas and giving people access to that as and when needed. So yes, multiple teams, I would say, and multiple stakeholders involved with that as well.
Yeah, I think that covers it very well. A very short answer to that really is probably, it definitely helps. In the idea being, if you can reduce the amount of different documents or different applications a little, in which if everyone's inputting information to an Excel who sends it off to another party to update that, to send it back across to the EA to upload it, it's a much longer and less efficient path than someone having a user access themselves to go directly into the tool and do so. So I think that is where it can be helpful as well. Those different groups who can be involved in a tool also.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So then I'll go on to another question, and this sort of also maybe gets to the crux of the matter, at least for a lot of teams. A question from Sudarshan, and by the way, Sudarshan, thank you. You've been a great contributor of questions over the last couple of days. Today you've asked, what is the typical use case that is worked or proved to show value to customers?
I'm guessing that was a question on what use cases Abacus is used for, is that right?
Well, yes, I think we can take it as that,
yeah.
Perhaps EA in general, but yeah, let's take the use of Abacus as the chosen tool.
Yeah, you can shoot me down if that wasn't the question, but I'll answer that question. I mean, there are multiple use cases, and I think it depends. And we have, in fact, I mean, we've got some customers who will, like I mentioned at the beginning, have a very specific focus on use cases that they're working on. So they might come to us and say, we're really looking to reduce the number of applications we have and the integrations, and the use cases around cloud migration. And there are times when they finish that use case and say, what else should we do? And there are other customers who really are looking for a tool for multiple use cases. So that could be, redefining processes for efficiency measures. We have, of course, specific customers who are working towards using multiple architectures and scenarios for building levels of compliance across architectures, especially from a few years ago when there were things like MiFID II coming in for the finance industry. That was a great idea of maybe even GDPR exactly as well, which was how compliant are we today and how compliant can we be in the next 6 or 12 months time. So that's another quite good or even specific use case that could open the door to other use cases. It's very rare that we kind of see these in isolation a lot of the time. If you're working on a compliance use case, we're looking at data and security classifications. If we're looking at application rationalization, maybe that also stems into renewing or removing existing capabilities or redefining processes to use the same application. So there could be a mixture of use cases involved. The quick thing I would just add to that as well, which is a tool should hopefully be able to cover all use cases. Try not to maybe focus on procuring a tool for just one use case. It's always good to have the capability to model any environment in any situation at any time, really.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And well, then I'll go to a question from Lily, which I think sort of feeds into the answer you just given there quite well. That's to say, well, the question is, what about the meta model? Is it better to define the meta model from scratch or to use an out-of-the-box meta model? And indeed, Lily, you mentioned the Avolution one as an example. Thank you. That's of course cool. But Andrew, I'm sure you'll explain. This obviously feeds into perhaps how you would fulfill the different use cases.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you wanted to define a meta model from scratch, technically you can. I wouldn't advise that. I think you've heard hopefully as well from Matt Dixon from the Open Group talking about TOGAF. There are a number of different frameworks and methodologies and notations that you could be using. If you find yourself defining something from scratch, from my experience, you'll quickly find you're defining something that probably already exists. And if you get to that stage, you really want to make sure that you can leverage the ability to combine different frameworks. So I know you've mentioned the Avolution framework here, but generally for all frameworks, there should be an ability to combine these. The Open Group has documentation on TOGAF and Archimate, for example, but really what we want to do is promote the idea of being able to use any framework at any time. Now, it becomes more stable over time, but at the beginning, you'll have a process team who wants to use BPMN. You have your architects over here who want to use UML for the modeling aspects. And then you have someone who wants to build this high-level capability map off the back of something like the process classification framework from APQC. And what you don't want to do is end up with a tool for each of those frameworks or individual areas for each of those frameworks. The difficulty is the theoretical side of combining them. The technical part is easy. So really, I would suggest using frameworks out of the box, use them as almost accelerators, but I would say always be making changes to them. I've yet to meet anyone who uses a pure TOGAF or a pure Archimate notation straight out of the box. There are always going to be some local customizations that you want to make as users to make it adaptable to your organization, really.
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah,
that's fine.
Thank you for that, guys. That was good. Okay, another question here. How can I integrate Abacus with Microsoft Teams?
Yeah, good question. I'll just go back to the Q&A side. I think they're moving. So integrating Abacus with MS Teams is straightforward. There are obviously other areas that you might want to integrate it to. So we mentioned things like Confluence and SharePoint. The main rationale behind that is to almost reduce the barrier to entry for some users, but mainly to make sure that people have access to content in Abacus from the environment that they already work in. So when you're talking to someone on Teams, you can reference parts of Abacus and send links to other parts of Teams where Abacus is hosted. Now that could be entire dashboards that you're embedding into Microsoft Teams, building your own channels in Teams with specific views for those users, and also, as Scott's mentioned, leverage those users who have access to edit the data as well. So from a technical perspective, we can send some more information on that to you, but certainly from a practical perspective, it just makes sense to have that data available to users as you're avoiding this kind of swivel chair approach that they have to go to another tool to find that information. It's just Abacus embedded in Teams. It doesn't have to look like an EA tool. It doesn't have to have Abacus branding. It's just your live portfolio, your live repository in an area where everyone can actually access that data.
Cool. Excellent. Well, so we had a question from Bhushan, which does link nicely with this. Though, actually, I can answer this one myself, I'm afraid. That's to say, I made reference to a session that we had been due to host in the small hours in the Asia Pacific region, which didn't unfortunately take place, and it was the session on scripting. So, and I mentioned this, I think, during the previous session with Network Rail. I'm not quite sure why that didn't go ahead, but the note that I got is that it will be run separately. So, and whether the APAC team will be doing that, or you never know, you may be hearing Andrew give another webinar fairly soon. But certainly there is an awful lot that can be undertaken in terms of integrating Abacus with other tools, whether it be something like Microsoft Teams or all the other applications that that customers want to retrieve data from or interchange data with, as well as the automation side of things, which is obviously what we were largely talking about earlier. So right now, I'm afraid there isn't a recording that we can send you on of that, but we'll certainly update you on a session it seems that we're going to be hosting separately. Okay, so then we've got a question from Michael that's come in. How many frameworks have you seen your clients generally use within a singular Abacus project? Because of the points you raise about the challenge of merging them, we've found this to be a tedious and at times frustrating process if using anything but 2 or 3 smaller frameworks.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think I'll be careful what I say, because the Avolution framework probably has maybe 6 or 7 references to other notations or methodologies as well. But when you're combining frameworks together, it usually has to be for a specific purpose. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the entire framework. So if you take a look at something like the Avolution framework around process modeling, we have aspects from BPMN, and there are other notations like EPC or standard flowchart stuff we could use, but BPMN is a very descriptive language for process modeling. There's probably over 30 different component types that we could have used, but we've chosen to use 4 or 5 of them because that was what was necessary to model processes to the level that we wanted to. Whether we have the tasks and activities, the decisions that are being made in the swim lanes, and that's all we really needed. And so trying to combine all the different timer events in that particular model could be useful, but certainly wasn't useful at the time. So I think even if you want to combine all of these frameworks together, you might want to be even more selective about certain parts of those frameworks. And even if you get to the stage where you do eventually combine, let's say 4 frameworks fully together, it's not necessarily the case that everyone sees that data. Some users might only be able to see that process domain, others might only be able to see that technology domain. So restricting access on those levels is important. But also, again, maybe more practically speaking, reach out to us, reach out to our community of users. They'll be more than happy to give you advice on some best practices, on what works and what doesn't work, and where there are crossovers between frameworks. Things like Archimate stemming from UML obviously has a close correlation there. Likewise, if you were looking at something like IT for IT and TOGAF, coming from the same body tends to make it a bit easier to actually combine those together. So certainly we can provide some guidance there. I would, again, maybe reiterating your point, don't use too many different notations and frameworks. You want to make sure it's simple enough to use and model things. We've heard of kind of the Franken model that Tim O'Neill's talked about before. So we do want to avoid that. But there are parts of certain frameworks that are useful. So I'd use the useful parts first.
Cool. Well, and indeed, I was going to mention the webinars that we've recorded in the past that you've referred to there, really, Andrew, the ones that I think often Tim has given with reference to the Franken model,
yes.
But certainly to the concept of creating a hybrid framework. I mean, it's a very powerful capability of Abacus. And to the point, one of the points that you made there of that, I think that very interesting feature in an Abacus of essentially allowing different users to view their part of the repository in the way that makes most sense to them.
Yep.
You know, that's, let's say, a really interesting feature of the tool.
Yeah, I think there was a presentation yesterday where you can kind of think of some of these notations as lenses. If you are using, let's just say you're just using Archimate out of the box, that's a lens of your data. Applying a different lens, a UML view or a more kind of C-level view, is just using the same data in a different perspective. So they can just be used as lenses rather than entire methodologies in their own right.
Cool. Thank you. And now we've got a comment that's coming from Brian. I don't know if this is Brian from Network Rail, but it could well be. But thank you, whichever Brian has posted this question. Having experience of TOGAF, COBIT, and ITIL, I'd strongly recommend starting with Avolution's framework and extend, evolve as and when required. I've cherry-picked elements of BPMN and ITIL, but also have some standards and authority settings where you could discuss changes, e.g. no use of supertypes, add a property to have types, e.g. capability type.
Perfect. Right, Brian's setting himself up for providing best practice for everyone there. So everyone's going to be reaching out to Brian now.
Indeed. Yes, Brian, we'll be coming back to you for another webinar soon. That's actually got in the chat window, so everyone will be able to see that, I think, anyway, if I didn't read that out clear enough. But yes, I mean, thank you. I mean, that's a good example of experience that you've gained. So thank you for sharing that. Actually, staying in the chat window, I can see a comment from Michael here. We use Archimate. I've imported some parts of the BPM framework for the process modeling. We actually have within Abacus itself a simple hybrid, which is TOGAF and Archimate, I believe. Do we have many people using that?
We've got a few people that we know as customers using it as well. I think, more recently, I think the Open Group have combined a few more elements from TOGAF and Archimate closer together, and things like the capability models in there and some of the notational views. But yeah, that's a good example of BPMN and Archimate being used together. Archimate as a concept of business process. It's fine at a high level until you actually want to model the underlying tasks and activities and events that are going on in the swim lanes. That is when you might want to introduce BPMN. So yeah, certainly not maybe a requirement from day one until that use case potentially comes up. You want to know that you have the flexibility in the tool to actually be able to model that in the future.